Wow. It really hits home when you see headlines about hacks at places like Steam and Coinbase, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
And, those are just like the really big ones we hear about, sort of the tip of the iceberg.
Exactly. They're more than just news stories, really. They're stark warnings about the dangers, the inherent vulnerabilities in concentrating so much user information in one place.
Yeah, these huge centralized
And it's that
securities.
classic honeypot scenario,
Yeah.
playing out again and again across the digital world.
Right. And it forces you to ask a really important question, I think. With these breaches feeling less like an if and more like a when,
Hmm.
how can we, as individuals, actually move towards something more secure, where we have more control?
Well, that's precisely what we're diving into today. We're going to explore this pressing need for decentralized, human-centric data design.
Oh, okay.
And we're drawing heavily from a really insightful recent conversation ArcBlock had with Dr. Alex Boyer. He's a leading expert in exactly this area.
Ah, Dr. Boyer. His background is fascinating, isn't it? He kind of brings together the tech side, computer science, with his deep understanding of how people actually relate to their data.
Yeah, and his work with My Data Global, it's all about empowering individuals, giving them more agency over their digital selves.
Which feels so necessary right now.
What's really compelling about his perspective, I find, is his focus on the lived experience. What it actually feels like for people whose data is held by big organizations, often without much say from their side.
Yeah, it brings that human element in.
Definitely. It moves it beyond just a technical problem.
So our goal today, our mission for this deep dive, is to really unpack what human-centric data design actually means, why it's so critical, especially with these constant threats,
Right.
and how it might offer a path towards more user control and maybe fundamentally more trust, especially compared to these failing centralized systems.
Sounds good. Let's get into it.
Okay, so let's start with the problem itself. These centralized systems. Coinbase in 2023, exposing emails, transaction histories. Then Steam in 2024, millions of accounts compromised. These aren't just flukes, are they?
No, not at all. Like we said, they're really symptoms of a much bigger systemic issue.
Yeah.
Centralized platforms, just by their very structure, become these incredibly attractive targets. Why?
Because all the goods are in one basket.
Exactly. They hold vast amounts of sensitive information all in one place. And Dr. Boyer, he pointed out that these systems often treat your data almost like it's their property.
Yeah, like an asset they own.
Right. Something they lock down, they control, and often with very little transparency, very little say for the actual person whose information it is, you're kind of cut out of the loop.
Which is, well, the complete opposite of what human-centric principles are trying to achieve.
Totally. It's about flipping that model entirely. Well, the human-centric approach really emphasizes giving users much more visibility into their data, much more control over their data. And it also champions this really important idea of data minimization.
Data minimization, meaning just collect less stuff.
Basically, yeah. Only collecting the absolute minimum amount of information that's strictly necessary for the service to function. Dr. Boyer argued, pretty convincingly, I think, that if companies like Coinbase and Steam had truly embraced these principles, the sheer amount and the sensitivity of the data exposed in those breaches could have been drastically reduced, which, would have limited the potential harm quite significantly.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's get specific. What does human-centric design actually mean in practice? It sounds good conceptually, but what does it look like?
So Dr. Boyer defines it as building a relationship of respect between individuals and the organizations holding their data.
A respectful relationship. Okay.
Yeah, and the key elements are things like giving users clear insight, real visibility into what data is being collected about them, making sure they can actually understand it, maybe even correct it if it's wrong or outdated.
Ah, the correction part is interesting.
And, crucially, giving them a real voice, some agency in how their data is actually used.
That feels so different from the usual experience where it often feels like a black box. You have no idea what's going on behind the curtain with your data.
Precisely. Centralized systems often operate on this assumption that the data they hold is, accurate, gospel truth.
Right.
But human-centric design starts from a different place. It acknowledges that data can be old, it can be incomplete, it can even be biased. So it tries to build in transparency and feedback loops, ways for users to help fix those issues.
Okay, can you give us some concrete examples? Like, how might a human-centric approach have changed things specifically for Coinbase or Steam?
Sure. Let's take Coinbase. A human-centric approach might have involved much stronger end-to-end encryption for your sensitive financial details, making it basically unreadable even if the system was breached.
Okay, so even if they get in, the data's useless.
Potentially, yes. Or perhaps giving users personal data spaces, like dedicated digital wallets where they hold the private keys and maintain control over their core transaction information, not the platform.
Putting the user in the driver's seat for the most sensitive stuff.
Exactly. And for Steam, well, it could simply be about being much stricter on data minimization, only collecting the data that is absolutely essential for you to play games and connect with friends, not building these huge, detailed user profiles that become such juicy targets for hackers.
Yeah, limiting the attack surface, essentially.
That's a good way to put it.
These hacks, Coinbase, Steam,
Yeah.
they really do feel like a massive wake-up call. Why is this shift towards human-centric design so, well, urgent right now?
They really are stark reminders, aren't they? The urgency comes down to several key factors, I think. First, as Dr. Boyer really stressed, it's about reducing risk by collecting less data. Simple as that.
Right.
If platforms like Steam just didn't hold on to so much personal, potentially sensitive information in the first place, well, there'd be less for criminals to steal if, or rather when, a breach occurs. This idea of privacy by design, baking it in from the start, significantly limits the potential fallout.
Makes perfect sense. Less data equals less to lose.
Second, it's really about giving users genuine control. Dr. Boyer shared some powerful examples, how people feel powerless trying to understand their credit score, or even just getting access to their own medical records from a doctor's office.
Yeah, that feeling of being locked out of your own information.
Exactly. Human-centric design aims to provide the tools for you to manage your data. Imagine, say, Coinbase users being able to instantly revoke access to certain data if they suspect a compromise, or keeping their most sensitive info stored locally, off the central servers entirely. It completely changes the game when a breach happens.
It really shifts the power dynamic, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Third, and this is increasingly important, it's about building trust as a core feature, not an afterthought.
And trust is a feature. I like that.
Dr. Boyer pointed out that trust isn't just, a nice feeling. It's a tangible competitive advantage now. We saw people moving towards decentralized wallets after the Coinbase issue. And look at the success of companies like Proton and Signal. They've built their brands around privacy.
People are voting with their feet or their clicks.
They are. They're actively seeking out and rewarding platforms they feel they can trust. Centralized platforms that fail to build and maintain that trust, they seriously risk losing their users. And that hurts the bottom line.
Definitely. Losing users is bad business.
Fourth, there's the whole aspect of reducing liability for the companies themselves.
Ah, okay. How so?
As Dr. Boyer explained, holding massive amounts of user data makes centralized systems carry significant legal and financial risks. Breaches, misuse. These lead to lawsuits, fines, reputational damage. Exploring options like using trusted third parties, maybe data trusts to handle data storage, could be a way for companies to mitigate some of that liability.
Data trusts, like organizations whose whole job is to manage data ethically.
Precisely. Organizations with a fiduciary duty, a legal obligation to manage data in the individual's best interests. This could have potentially limited some of the fallout for Coinbase, for example.
So sharing the burden almost, sharing the risk.
In a way, yes. And finally, number 5, we have to consider pushing back against the surveillance economy.
The model where our data is the product.
Exactly. Dr. Boyer warned about how many centralized systems, including a lot of current AI development, are built on business models that rely on harvesting enormous amounts of user data, primarily for targeted advertising. Human-centric AI, in contrast, could be trained on data that stays right there on your device. It respects your privacy and avoids creating these massive, centralized data pools that are so vulnerable to breaches and misuse.
Okay, so just to recap, less risk through minimization, more user control, building trust, reducing company liability, and countering that surveillance model. That's a pretty compelling case for why this shift is so critical right now.
It really is. The status quo is becoming increasingly untenable.
Let's dig a bit deeper into Dr. Boyer's specific insights from that ArcBlock conversation. What were some of the key takeaways for you?
Well, his background, that blend of computer science and the human interaction side, really shapes how he sees things. He talked a lot about how companies often collect data and then make all these assumptions about users, without really understanding their individual context or experience.
Treating data as a substitute for actually talking to people.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. He realized data often becomes this kind of shortcut used instead of genuine engagement. It leads to us becoming just like collections of data points rather than actual humans with complex lives.
I think we all feel that sometimes.
And he really hammered home the point that data is almost always just a snapshot in time. It's often outdated, incomplete, or reflects certain biases.
It's not the whole picture.
Not at all. And this can lead to unfair judgments, inaccurate decisions being made about people. So his vision is really about creating a much healthier relationship, one where individuals can actually see their data, understand it, and maybe even use it for their own benefit.
That idea, using my data for my benefit, that's powerful.
It is. And for data that you can't directly see, think about those complex algorithms determining credit scores or insurance premiums.
Yeah, the black boxes.
Right. For those, Dr. Boyer stressed the absolute need for transparency in the processes. We need oversight mechanisms, ways to intervene and correct errors, and channels for individuals to actually be involved in data-driven decisions that significantly affect their lives.
So not just seeing the data, but understanding the system around it.
Exactly. His core message really boiled down to being treated like a human being in these service relationships, not just, a record in a database. That credit score example he used, it perfectly illustrates the lack of visibility and control most people experience right now. It's this invisible system with huge impact, but we get little insider say.
Yeah, totally. Did he talk about solutions? Like, how do we get that visibility?
They discussed the initial idea of, say, a simple dashboard where you could see all your data laid out.
Okay, that sounds like a start.
It is, but Dr. Boyer made a really crucial point. Just dumping raw data on people isn't enough. It needs context. It needs to be presented in a way that's actually understandable, meaningful for everyday users. He mentioned the great work Hestia's DigiPower Academy is doing, using graphs and visuals to make data accessible.
So it's not just access, it's comprehension, making sense of it all.
Precisely. And they also touched on that moment in time aspect again, how data is intrinsically linked to personal life events. Dr. Boyer cautioned companies against treating data as static. He emphasized the need for an ongoing relationship, a dialogue with the user, to ensure the data stays accurate and relevant over time.
Recognizing that people change, situations change, and data needs to reflect that reality. It's not a one-time snapshot.
Exactly, it's dynamic.
Now, a big question always comes up. Does giving users more control hurt businesses? Is it bad for the bottom line? Dr. Boyer addressed this too, didn't he? He saw benefits for businesses.
Oh, absolutely. He directly challenged that zero-sum thinking. He highlighted the My Data philosophy, which is all about finding ways for both individuals and businesses to benefit. It's not an either situation.
Okay, interesting. So what are these business advantages?
He outlined several key ones. First, and maybe foremost, trust. We touched on this, but he elaborated. When people feel cut out of the loop or misunderstood because of how their data is inferred or used, it erodes trust. And that directly impacts the bottom line. He shared a really striking statistic from his research on GDPR data requests.
GDPR, the European privacy law.
That's the one. He found a huge 52% of people said they lost trust in a company because of how poorly their data request was handled. But interestingly, 14% actually reported an increase in trust when the company was transparent, respectful, and humane about it.
Wow, so bad handling really hurts, but good handling can actually build loyalty.
Exactly. It links directly to ethical data use becoming a differentiator. Think Apple's on-device processing or Proton's privacy focus. It builds brand value.
Okay, trust is number one. What else?
Second, consent. With regulations like GDPR pushing towards more dynamic, ongoing consent, involving customers makes sense. Keeping them informed, explaining why you need certain data, builds buy-in. It helps businesses adapt to changing rules and, frankly, avoid violations and fines.
So it's about partnership, not just ticking a box.
Right. Third, accuracy. This seems obvious, but it's huge. Who knows your data better than you?
Yeah.
Involving data subjects lets them spot errors, provide context. Dr. Boyer emphasized how much value there is in that human context that raw data often misses entirely. You get much higher quality data.
Makes total sense. My data, my context.
Fourth, mitigating liability. We mentioned this before in the context of risk, but outsourcing data storage to specialized third parties' data trusts. Personal data stores can significantly lower a business's direct legal and financial exposure if something goes wrong.
Less risk for the company holding the primary relationship.
Exactly. And finally, number 5, and this might seem counterintuitive, better customer targeting.
Better targeting by giving users more control. How does that work?
Well, Dr. Boyer contrasted the current best guess, often creepy, advertising based on mass surveillance, with models like VRM, vendor relationship management.
Okay, VRM.
In VRM, individuals proactively and willingly share specific needs or purchase intentions with trusted vendors. Think, I'm looking to buy a new bike in the next month.
So I tell them what I want instead of them guessing.
Precisely.
Hmm.
This leads to much, much higher quality leads for businesses. You're getting signals directly from motivated buyers. He used the analogy. Would you rather pay a little more for one genuinely interested lead or pennies for thousands of irrelevant ones based on shaky inferences?
A quality lead, definitely. Better ROI.
Right. And as a societal benefit, it dramatically reduces the need for that pervasive, privacy-invasive mass data harvesting we see everywhere.
So it's not just good for business, it's potentially better for society too. Less digital noise, less surveillance. That's a really different way of looking at it. Dr. Boyer also talked about the individual as the point of integration for all their data, right? Can you expand on that idea?
Yeah, he painted this picture of the future where you, the individual, are at the center. You're the one collecting and managing your various credentials, your digital identity data, your personal information, all in one place under your control.
Like a personal data hub.
Kind of, yeah. He mentioned key technologies that could enable this, things like secure data spaces, digital wallets, and importantly, interoperability protocols. Things like JLink or FedID, which allow different systems to talk to each other securely.
So all my different digital bits and pieces can connect through me.
That's the vision. But he stressed, and this is critical, that whatever technology is used, the non-negotiable part is that it must guarantee user control.
Guarantee control.
That control can come through different mechanisms. Legally, like with data trusts having that fiduciary duty we talked about. Technically, through strong cryptography, like end-to-end encryption or on-device processing where the data doesn't even leave your phone, or it can be built into the business model itself, companies that genuinely respect the user's role. He contrasted, say, the data practices of some large AI models with newer, more user-centric alternatives, like Kin AI or PPI.
So the tech is important, but the underlying principle of control is paramount.
Exactly. And he also cautioned that it's more complex than just giving people a dashboard with a bunch of permission toggles.
Right, we talked about understanding the data.
Yes. The data and the permissions need to be presented in ways that are actually meaningful and manageable for everyday people. It comes back to being able to easily see, edit, and understand the data held about you, including, importantly, any inferences or assumptions being made from that data. He mentioned how often advertising profiles on places like Facebook or Instagram get things hilariously wrong.
Yeah, I've seen some weird ads targeted at me. It highlights that need for correction, which brings us back to the human element, letting us fix the mirror when it's distorted. Okay, thinking about the people building the next generation of apps and services, the startups. What was Dr. Boyer's core advice for them on human-centric design?
His advice was very direct. Adopt privacy by design as your fundamental strategy. From day one.
Build it in, don't bolt it on later.
Precisely. He pointed to the practices of ethical, privacy-first providers, Proton, Nord, Signal, Hestia, SNPO, Kin AI companies that often use end-to-end encryption specifically so that even they cannot access user data. That's a strong commitment.
That sends a clear message to users.
It really does. He also listed other crucial ethical steps, making strong, privacy-respecting design choices throughout the user experience, never training AI on user data without explicit informed consent, and relentlessly practicing data minimization. Only collect what you absolutely need to deliver the service.
Got it. Minimize, be transparent, get consent. What about those free tools that are so tempting for startups?
Ah, yes, he had a specific warning there. Be very careful with tools that seem free, like Google Analytics or Facebook's Audience Network.
Why is that?
Because, as he explained, the price is often that these tools send user data back to the big platforms. So the startup effectively becomes a data collection outpost, a data hoover for Google or Facebook.
Oof, that's a hidden cost most startups probably don't think about.
Definitely something to be aware of. And finally, he really emphasized the need for startups to conduct rigorous third-party code hygiene audits.
Meaning?
Meaning checking all the code you use, including libraries or services from other companies, to make absolutely sure it tightly controls how user data is collected and shared. You need to be able to confidently explain and guarantee to your users exactly how their data is being handled, end to end. That builds trust.
You need to know what's under the hood, basically, and be upfront about it. Okay, what about bigger, more established companies? Mid-market enterprises. Did he have advice for them?
He did. He framed it as a sort of hypothetical cafe conversation with a chief data officer, a CDO.
Okay, I like that. What's the advice?
His key practical recommendation was this: create a simple, understandable one-page document. Just one page. And on that page, clearly explain: what user data do you collect? How exactly do you use it? Where is it stored? What do you observe or infer from it? Who do you share it with specifically? And what do your partners or subsidiaries do with it?
A plain English, one-page summary of everything data-related.
Exactly. No jargon, no legalese. And he stressed, you must be able to explain this clearly to your users if you want to build any kind of trust. Then, he suggested the CDO should reflect. How can we make our data and our processes more visible, more inclusive for our users? Think of users as having a seat at the strategy table when it comes to their own information.
Shifting the internal mindset, seeing users as partners in data.
Right. And then he added a crucial step. The CDO should read that one-page summary as if they were a regular person, maybe even their own child, and ask honestly, does this feel respectful? Does it feel fair?
Putting themselves in the user's shoes?
Yes. And he pushed further. Encourage a shift from seeing data as a static asset to be managed to viewing it as a living, flowing dialogue with the individual. How would that perspective change the summary?
That's a profound shift. Data as dialogue.
He wrapped it up with a really sharp bottom line. If you can't explain your data practices to a 12-year-old, you probably can't defend them ethically either.
Ouch. But true. It cuts right through those dense privacy policies nobody reads.
Exactly. It highlights how ineffective those often are at actually informing people or building trust.
Simplicity and clarity as the benchmark for ethics. That's powerful. Looking ahead then, what did Dr. Boyer see as the main catalyst? What will actually make human-centric data the default, the norm?
Well, while he acknowledged that technology, evolution, and changing consumer demands play a part, Dr. Boyer was pretty firm in his conviction that the biggest drivers will need to be better regulation and, crucially, much stronger enforcement of that regulation.
Regulation with teeth.
Exactly. He feels that's essential to really counteract the deeply embedded business models built around surveillance and the attention economy.
He pointed out that many existing regulations, while well-intentioned, currently lack sufficient teeth to force widespread change.
So policy and enforcement are key levers.
He did see some glimmers of hope, though. Things like the development of more human-centric AI, personal digital assistants focused on user needs, and new apps that highlight the gaps in what current big platforms offer, focusing more on life-centric goals rather than platform-centric ones.
So innovation is happening in pockets.
Yes, but he stressed this is fundamentally a socio-technical problem. It requires more than just better tech. Education is vital. Educating citizens, providers, business owners, technologists about these issues. And we need to address the disconnect between current market forces and what individuals actually need for their well-being.
A multifaceted approach. He also made a great point about governments and national authorities needing to lead by example. They should model human-centric thinking in their own digital infrastructure and policies. That helps set standards and builds public trust.
Walk the talk, essentially.
Right. So ultimately, while tech and market demand contribute, Dr. Boyer's outlook seems to be that strong policies, clear regulations, and consistent, meaningful enforcement are probably what's needed to really shift the entire market. Oh, and he did mention that AI assistants could potentially accelerate this shift if they genuinely focus on individual, life-centric goals and provide tangible benefits, making ethical data handling a more compelling selling point.
Interesting. So AI could be part of the solution if done right. He also talked about debunking myths around data, didn't he? What was the biggest one for the average person?
Yes, he did. The biggest myth he identified for everyday people is this idea that data is irrelevant, boring, and doesn't really connect to their actual lives.
That it's just abstract stuff happening somewhere else.
Exactly. He strongly countered this, explaining that data is actually like a mirror of your life. It encodes basically every digital interaction you have, and it influences countless decisions that directly affect you, from loan applications to job prospects to insurance rates.
It's not abstract at all. It has very real-world consequences.
Precisely. His argument was that people aren't actually disinterested, they're disempowered. They lack the tools and the context to see, understand, and act on their data as meaningful information about them. The demand for control isn't always vocalized because the concepts, the possibility of real agency, isn't yet tangible or visible for most people.
So it's a lack of tools and understanding, not a lack of interest.
That was his take. And he also tackled a key myth for businesses.
Different.
The pervasive idea of viewing data as a static asset that needs to be hoarded, accumulated like digital gold.
Right, the more data is always better mentality.
He offered a compelling alternative. Think of data not as a stagnant pool, but as a river of signals, a constantly flowing stream reflecting user activity, needs, and intentions right now.
Data as a dynamic flow.
Yeah. And the real value comes not from hoarding the old water, but from tapping into this current flow and, crucially, connecting it back to the individual. That provides up-to-date information in real-life context. He emphasized the immense value of building that trustworthy relationship, becoming an integrated, helpful part of the user's digital workflow or life.
Being useful, not just extractive.
Exactly. He warned businesses against ignoring the human element, solely focusing on data harvesting. That path, he argued, leads to worse data because it lacks context and verification, zero trust, and ultimately a very limited understanding of the individual's actual life and needs.
You miss the forest for the trees, focusing only on the data points.
You really do. He kind of summed it up with the sentiment. Prioritize being part of the user's story, helping them achieve their goals, rather than just sending them ads based on assumptions. Respect individuals' needs beyond just generating profit. And he highlighted that fundamental value exchange. Provide something genuinely useful and users will engage. And often, they'll even be willing to pay for real value.
Provide value, build trust, and the business benefits follow. That's a really powerful counter-narrative. Well, this has been an absolutely fascinating deep dive. The need for human-centric data design feels clearer and more urgent than ever, especially thinking back to those Coinbase and Steam breaches and weaving in Dr. Alex Boyer's really valuable insights.
Absolutely. It really drives home that understanding and controlling your data isn't some, niche technical concern anymore. It's becoming a fundamental aspect of how we navigate the digital age safely and effectively.
It really is. So here's a final thought we want to leave you, the listener, with, building directly on Dr. Boyer's insights. Knowing what you now know about human-centric principles, take a moment to think. What's one digital service you use regularly where you'd really like to see a more human-centric approach implemented? And maybe more importantly, what would that actually look like for you in practical terms? How would it change your experience?
That's a great question to reflect on. What would more control and transparency actually mean in your daily digital life?
Definitely food for thought. Thanks so much for taking this deep dive with us today into such an incredibly important topic.